The estate agent had described the house as having character, which Mara had learned in the course of viewing 14 properties over 6 weeks was the word used for houses that had been lived in by people who left marks. Most of those marks were cosmetic wallpaper chosen in the confident certainty of a taste that had not aged well. A kitchen extended in the 80s with materials that were already apologizing for themselves. A bathroom suite in a shade of avocado that had been fashionable once and had since become a monument to the hubris of fashionability. The house on Selby Road had a different kind of character. She noticed it first in the way the letting agent, a young man named Scott, who wore too much cologne and talked without pause to fill silence he was clearly uncomfortable with, went quiet when he opened the front door, just for a second. A small stutter in his commentary quickly recovered, the way a person recovers when they have remembered something they have been successfully not thinking about and have successfully returned to not thinking about it. She noticed it. She filed it. She went inside. The house itself was ordinary. This was the first thing she told her sister on the phone that evening, sitting on the floor of the front room with her back against the wall, and her voice carrying in the way voices do in empty houses. It was a mid-terrace on a residential street in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. 2 bedrooms, a garden that had been left to manage its own affairs, a kitchen with adequate light. The ceilings were higher than the price suggested. The previous tenants had left it clean in a functional sense, though there were small absences. Picture hooks with no pictures, a curtain rail in the second bedroom with no curtain rod, a set of marks on the doorframe of the kitchen that Mara recognized, after a moment, as the kind of family makes to track a child's height, the dates and initials recorded in pencil, and then painted over imperfectly, so that they were invisible in the wrong light and legible in the right. She took the house because it was £30 a month below the market rate, and she had recently become a person who needed to think carefully about £30 a month. She had stood in the empty front room while Scott talked about storage heaters and off-street parking, and looked at the afternoon light coming through the bay window and the dust turning in it, and thought, this is a place where someone could start again. She was not sure she believed in starting again. Exactly, she had reached the age at which she understood that you don't start again so much as continue differently. But the sentiment had enough shape to it to be useful, which was sufficient. The divorce had not been acrimonious, which she had been grateful for at the time and had since come to understand was its own kind of difficulty. The absence of a fight meant the absence of a clear narrative. And without a narrative, she had spent the better part of 8 months not knowing which emotion she was supposed to be having, or in what order, moving through them at random, like a person trying doors in an unfamiliar building, most of them locked. The house, with its empty rooms and its garden that needed work, and its 40-minute commute, felt like a project. She needed a project. She signed the lease on a Tuesday and moved in the following Saturday with a hired van and her friend Diane, who helped carry boxes, and did not comment on the fact that all the boxes were Mara's, and none of them were a shared life being divided, because Diane was a good friend and understood which observations were useful. The first odd thing happened on the Sunday, her second morning. She had left the bedroom door open when she went to sleep, as she always did, a habit from childhood that she had never examined closely enough to explain. She woke to find it closed. She was not troubled by this. Houses settle. Old doors move on their hinges. There was a rational explanation, and she was the sort of person who preferred rational explanations and was good at finding them. She opened the door and went downstairs and made coffee, and did not think about it again until the following morning, when she found it closed again, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. She simply hadn't registered it as a thing that required attention. It was at the top of the stairs, in the narrow space between the landing and the door to the second bedroom, a pocket of air that was noticeably consistently colder than the air a foot in either direction. She checked the window at the end of the landing. It was well sealed. She checked the door to the second bedroom for gaps around the frame. There were none significant. She told herself it was a quirk of the insulation, a cold spot in the wall behind the plaster, a feature of the building's particular geometry that created a pocket of still air that didn't circulate with the heating. She had an explanation. The explanation was adequate. She stopped checking the window. She was less good at explaining the handprint. It appeared on the fifth morning on the inside of the bathroom window, the lower pane, at the height a small person would reach with an outstretched arm. It was not a smear, not the accidental mark of a hand passing. It was a deliberate placement, palm and each finger distinct, as though someone had pressed their hand to the glass and held it there for a moment, making sure the impression was complete. Mara stood in the bathroom doorway for a long moment, her hair still wet from the shower she had taken in the ensuite, looking at it. She was aware her breathing had changed. She made it change back. Then she went downstairs, made coffee, came back upstairs with the coffee, looked at it again, and wiped it off with a cloth. She was thorough. She dried the glass. She checked the window latch, which was fastened from the inside. She went to work. She found it again the next morning. Same hand, same position, same 5 fingers spread with the same careful deliberateness. She wiped it off again, more deliberately this time, and checked the latch again, and found it fastened again, and went to work. She did not mention it to anyone because she could hear how it would sound, and she was a person who was careful about how things sounded. But a sustained low pressure, the feeling of a word on the tip of the tongue that will not resolve. She went to work and came home and cooked and watched television and called her sister and answered emails and did all the ordinary things that constitute a life. And the house did its ordinary things around her. And underneath all of it, there was the thing that was not ordinary, steady as a held note. The door closed each morning without fail. The cold spot remained at the top of the stairs, precisely located, exactly the same temperature each time she walked through it. She found the handprint twice more and stopped wiping it off, not because she had made peace with it, but because she had grown tired of the ritual of erasure, the performance of a response that changed nothing. It came back each time. It was not interested in her response. The house was quiet in the way that certain houses are quiet, not empty, but withheld, as though it were listening as carefully as she was. She slept well, which surprised her. She had expected the usual difficulties of a new place, the foreign sounds, the unfamiliar dark, the way a strange ceiling looks in the first weeks before your eyes have mapped it and accepted it as the ceiling that will be above you when you open your eyes each morning for the foreseeable future. She had lived alone before, in her early 20s, and remembered the particular vigilance of the first weeks, the way every creak translated itself into a question before it resolved into an answer. But she slept deeply here, and without the dreams she had been having in the months after the divorce, the ones in which she was looking for something in a house she didn't recognize, moving from room to room with the particular dream certainty that she had left something important somewhere and was running out of time to find it. Those dreams stopped when she moved to Selby Road, which she found she was grateful for without examining too closely what it meant. She told Diane she was settling in. Diane asked if she was eating properly. Mara said yes. Both of these statements were approximately true. On the 5th night, she woke at 3 in the morning. She woke completely without the gradual surfacing of normal waking. She was simply awake in the dark, with her eyes open. The room was very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a sleeping house, which has its own faint ambience, the settling, the distant traffic. the small mechanical sounds of a building maintaining itself. This was a different quality of silence, the silence of something waiting. She lay still and noticed that she could not hear anything at all. Not the hum of the refrigerator from downstairs, which she had begun to find comforting in its constancy. Not the slight movement of air through the gap under the bedroom door. Nothing. The silence pressed against her ears with the physical quality of water. She was not, she told herself, afraid. She had always been functional in the middle of the night, steadier than she was in daylight at tasks that required the deliberate suppression of response. She had sat with her mother through 2 nights of hospital vigils and had been the one who remained when others needed air. She was a person who stayed. She lay still and listened to the silence and told herself that she was listening for the thing that would explain it. The fox in the garden, the neighbor's television through a shared wall, and waited for the silence to resolve into something that had a name. Then she heard the footsteps. They were at the top of the stairs first, the cold spot, she thought incongruously, and then on the landing, moving toward her door with the slow, considered placement of bare feet on bare floorboards. Small feet. Light, but not light enough to be a trick of the building's settling. These were deliberate, sequential, the sounds of a body navigating a familiar route in the dark. A child who knew the house. A child who knew, perhaps, which boards to avoid and which ones didn't matter. 4 steps. 5. A pause of 3 or 4 seconds that Mara spent not breathing. Then, very clearly as anything she had ever heard, the sound of a small body lowering itself against the other side of the door. Not a knock, not a scratch, but the soft thud and creak of slight weight resting against wood, settling in. Mara did not move. She lay with her eyes fixed on the ceiling and her hands flat at her sides, and her breathing controlled with the careful steadiness of a person who has decided that one kind of response is better than another and has not yet identified which kind. The ceiling was white, with a hairline crack running from the light fitting toward the window, a crack she had mapped in her first wakeful nights here and had stopped seeing once the house became familiar. She looked at it now. She counted the seconds, got to 40, lost count, started again. The cold on the left side of her face was steady and close. She thought about the handprint on the bathroom window. She thought about the height of it. She thought about the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame, painted over imperfectly, and about the curtain rod in the second bedroom that had been taken down and not replaced, as though someone had decided there was no longer any need to make that room comfortable for a person who might sleep there. The silence resumed. It lasted a very long time. At some point during that long time she became aware that the temperature in the room had dropped. Not dramatically, not the sharp cold of an open window, but the slow settling of cold that comes from something cold being close by for an extended period. She could feel it against the left side of her face, which was turned toward the door. She did not open the door. She remained very still for what she estimated was another 20 minutes. Though she had no reliable way to measure it, time in that kind of dark does not behave as it does in daylight. She was not sure later whether or not opening the door had been courage or its opposite, whether she had made a decision or simply failed to make one, and she found, when she examined it the next day in the ordinary light, that the distinction didn't resolve cleanly. She lay still until the gray light of early morning began to show through the curtain gap, and the cold receded by degrees, and somewhere downstairs the refrigerator resumed its low, reliable hum. Then she got up, and she opened the bedroom door, and the landing was empty, and the cold spot at the top of the stairs was exactly where it always was, and the bathroom door was ajar showing nothing, and the house was just a house in the ordinary morning light, with picture hooks and no pictures and a garden that needed attention. She stood on the landing for a moment. The morning light came through the window at the end in its ordinary way, making a rectangle of pale gold on the floorboards that shifted slightly as a car passed on the street below. The floorboards were bare hardwood, pale oak, and they were... She crouched and looked at them properly for the first time, the kind of boards that would carry sound cleanly, every footstep distinct and exactly located, no ambiguity in them. She pressed her own bare foot flat against one and lifted it and looked at the impression of warmth it left, already fading. Then she stood and looked at the door to the second bedroom, which was closed as it generally was. She had not been inside it since the first day. She had told herself this was because she didn't need the space and had no reason to use it. She looked at the faint mark on the wall beside the banister that she had not consciously registered before. Low down, at the height a child's hand would reach while navigating the stairs in the dark, a slight shine in the paint where a small palm had touched the same spot enough times to leave its oils in the surface. She went downstairs and made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table in the early light and drank it and looked at the garden, which was doing what neglected gardens do in October, going to seed in a way that was, at this hour, almost beautiful, the long grass silver with dew, the overgrown buddleia at the back fence still holding its last ragged blooms. She thought about the footsteps. She thought about the cold. She thought about the weight against the door. She thought about the pencil marks on the door frame. The careful height measurements, the initials. She hadn't been able to make out the initials clearly, but she had seen enough to count them. One set of initials. One child. Someone had stood here in this kitchen once, probably at this hour, possibly with coffee, and watched a child grow incrementally taller against this doorframe, and had marked each increment with a pencil and a date, because that is what you do when something is growing and you want proof of it. She did not want to leave. This was the answer that kept arriving, quiet and stubborn, every time she posed the question to herself. She was not sure it was a rational answer. She was not sure it was her answer. Entirely. There was something about the not wanting that felt larger than her, felt like it had been in the house before she arrived, and was simply passing through her now, the way cold air passes through an open room. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cup and stood at the sink looking out at the garden where the dew was already lifting off the long grass in the thin morning warmth. She looked at the kitchen doorframe one more time, at the ghost of the marks beneath the paint. She had a cloth in her hand. She put it down. She left the marks where they were, under the paint, where someone had put them a long time ago in the reasonable expectation that they would stay. The second bedroom door had been closed since she moved in. Mara opened it on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the night on the landing, in the flat gray light of a November morning that made everything look like a draft of itself. Turning the thought over the way you turn over something found on the ground. Curious, a little reluctant to commit to picking it up, aware that picking it up commits you to whatever it turns out to be. There was always a reason to leave it for tomorrow. She ran out of tomorrows at some point during that gray Wednesday morning and simply opened it, quickly, without ceremony, as though speed might reduce the weight of the act, and stood in the doorway and looked. The room was empty in the way that unused rooms are empty, not just without furniture, but without the residue of habitation, except that it was not entirely without residue. The curtain rod was still missing, leaving bare metal brackets either side of the window and a rectangle of flat winter sky that gave the room a flayed, unfinished look. There was a mark on the carpet near the far wall, a faint circle of darker pile, the kind left by a piece of furniture that has stood in one place long enough to compress the fibers below recovery. A bed, perhaps, or a wardrobe, or both. There was a dent in the skirting board under the window, the kind a small heel makes when a child sits on the sill and swings its legs. Applied with the deliberate care of someone who has chosen exactly the right place for it, a small yellow star, slightly faded at its edges. Mara looked at it for a long time without crossing the threshold. Then she pulled the door closed and went to work and spent the day in the ordinary business of the office, and told herself she was not thinking about the star, which was not entirely true. She started with the letting agency. She called during her lunch break on the Monday, standing outside her office building with the wind coming off the river and her coat not quite adequate to it, and spoke with a young woman who checked the property record and told her, with the slightly overbright efficiency of someone delivering information they have been trained not to editorially embellish, that the property had been managed by the agency for 6 years, that the previous tenants had vacated in good standing 18 months prior, and that before them, the property had stood vacant for 8 months. Mara asked who had lived there before the vacant period. There was a pause, the sound of keys, a slightly longer pause. The young woman said that the tenancy before the vacant period was listed as a private arrangement made directly with the landlord, not managed through the agency, and that accordingly she didn't have further details. Her tone was the tone of a person who has found the end of the information and is professionally comfortable with that being the end of the conversation. Mara asked for the landlord's name. She was given it, David Collier, with a mobile number. She called the number on the Monday afternoon and it rang out. She called it again on the Wednesday and it rang out again. On the Wednesday evening she left a message, careful, neutral, saying only that she was the current tenant at the property, that she had a question about the house's history, and that she would appreciate a call back at his convenience. Her tone, she thought as she hung up, was the tone of someone who was not alarmed. She worked on that. He did not call back. She took a half day on Friday and went to the council archive. It was housed in a civic building 20 minutes from her office, a building of the sort that was optimistic when it was built in the early 1970s and had since settled into a resigned functionality. Its foyer surfaced with slightly different carpet squares in slightly different shades of brown that charted, for anyone paying attention, several decades of piecemeal repair. The archive itself was on the lower ground floor, cooler than the rest of the building, with the particular smell of older paper not unpleasant, a smell of patience and preserved time. The archivist was a quiet man in his 60s named Graham, who moved through the stacks with the unhurried confidence of someone who has known where everything is for a very long time and has stopped needing to think about it. He helped her locate the planning records and residency documentation for Selby Road without asking why she wanted them, which she appreciated. Then a family of 4, then a widow who stayed for 19 years. The decades turning in the ledgers with the quiet regularity of a life that is ordinary and therefore fortunate. She found the planning applications for the rear extension granted in 1978 and for the loft conversion refused in 1993. The various names of the various tenants who had passed through on their way to somewhere else. What she could not find, what was not misfiled, not accidentally omitted but cleanly, deliberately absent, were the records for a period of approximately 3 years in the mid-1990s. The gap sat in the filing like a pulled tooth. Everything around it intact, the space itself unmistakable. Whatever had occupied that period had been removed with a thoroughness that required effort, and effort requires intention. Graham, when she pointed to the gap and named it as such, looked at it with the expression of a man who has encountered this particular absence before, on 1 or 2 occasions over a long career, and who has found it professionally advisable not to develop a view on it. She did not tell anyone about the archive visit immediately. She carried it home on the tube with the ordinary rush hour crowd and sat with it through a working Thursday, and then told her neighbor about it that evening, leaning over the garden fence in the thin November dark while the other gardens on the street glowed with their lit windows and the smell of someone's wood smoke drifted over from the next street. Mrs. Holt was in her late 70s, a compact, carefully dressed woman who had lived on Selby Road for 41 years and who had, in the 3 weeks of Mara's tenancy, delivered a jar of homemade chutney with a handwritten label, commented twice on the state of the garden in a tone that was not unkind, and demonstrated throughout the careful neighborly attentiveness of someone who was watching without wishing to appear to be watching, a quality that Mara, who had been watched herself in this way at various points in her life, recognized and had decided to trust. She listened to what Mara said about the archive with her hands folded on the top of the fence and her eyes on the middle distance. Then she said there had been a family. She said it in the way of a person releasing something they have held for a long time, with a slight quality of relief that the releasing had been prompted by someone else and was therefore not, strictly speaking, her fault. A couple and a little girl. They had been there for 3 years or so. She couldn't be more precise than that. Her memory for dates, she said, was not what it had been, though her memory for other things remained sharp enough. She remembered the little girl. She had been the kind of child you noticed and remembered, quieter than most, with a gravity that sat oddly in something so small. The kind of child who watched things carefully and said very little, and when she did say something made you feel that she had thought about it for longer than children usually do. She had waved to Mrs. Holt across the fence on several occasions. She had been 6 or 7, one or the other. Mara asked what had happened to them. Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment, her hands still on the fence, and then she said that they had left. One morning there had been a family in the house, and by the next morning they had not been, and she had not known they were going and had not had a chance to say goodbye to anyone. And the house had stood empty for some time after that, long enough that she had begun to notice the empty quality of it in a way that was different from ordinary vacancy. She said all of this in the measured tone of a woman who has said as much as she intends to say on a particular subject. And Mara, who had grown up in a house with a woman who used that same tone and knew the pointlessness of pushing against it, thanked her and went inside. She searched online that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a glass of wine she drank more quickly than she intended to. She searched the address and found nothing significant. A planning notice, an old listing from when the house was sold in 2002, a neighborhood watch bulletin from 2011. She searched for incidents at the address and found nothing. She tried various combinations of words that circled the thing she was trying to find without naming it directly, because naming it directly felt like a threshold she was not ready to cross at the kitchen table on a Thursday night, and found nothing useful. Then she sat for a while with her wine and the sound of the house around her, which was its normal sound now, familiar and close, and she thought about a quiet child who watched things carefully and did not say very much, and about a yellow star on a window frame placed at the height of a 7-year-old's reach. She found the name the next morning. It was scratched into the painted wood of the interior wall of the airing cupboard, the small, deep cupboard off the upstairs hallway that housed the hot water cylinder and a shelf of abandoned things left by previous tenants. A tin of WD-40, a broken curtain hook, a child's sock, single and balled up, faded pink. She had opened it looking for the stopcock and found instead, at the level of her knee, on the inner wall behind the cylinder, where it would be entirely invisible to any adult standing upright. Deliberate force of someone who understood the difference between a mark made in passing and a mark made to last. Iris. She crouched in the narrow entrance with one hand braced against the doorframe and the warmth of the cylinder against her face, and she looked at the name for a long time. The R conscientious and careful, the S over large, as though the hand had slowed on the complicated curve of it and wanted to get it right. Old enough to know what it meant to leave something behind deliberately, and to want something of herself to remain when everything else, she wasn't sure why, except that it felt like something that should remain exactly where it was, in the dark, behind the cylinder, exactly as it had been left. That night she set her phone to record on the shelf opposite her bed, propped against a stack of books with the camera facing the room at the angle that would take in most of the floor space and the door. She felt, as she arranged it, the slight self-consciousness of a person doing something they are not sure they believe in, a ritual of the rational, evidence gathering as a way of staying on the right side of the line between taking something seriously and giving in to it. She went to sleep. She slept as she always did in this house, deeply, without apparent disturbance, waking at her usual hour to the closed door and the light coming gray through the curtains. She remembered no dreams. She lay still for a moment in the particular stillness of a morning after a night you have been paying attention to, listening to the house arrange itself around her, and then she got up and retrieved the phone from the shelf. The motion sensor had triggered at 4:47 in the morning and run until the battery warning cut it off just after 5:30. She took the phone downstairs and made coffee and sat with it at the kitchen table and told herself she was not afraid. This was on balance true. Like a person who has found a door they have not seen before and has their hand on the handle. She held the phone. The file icon sat on the screen, waiting. She was on the point of pressing play when her work alarm went off from the bedroom upstairs, and she put the phone face down on the table and went upstairs and got in the shower and let the warm water run for longer than usual. And by the time she was dressed, the decision had somehow been made without her, and she picked the phone up and put it in her bag and went to work. She cooked dinner, pasta, automatic, and then washed up and sat down at the table across from it, and they regarded each other in the kitchen quiet. She thought about the name in the airing cupboard and about Mrs. Holt's careful face in the garden dark. She thought about the yellow star on the window frame and about the compressed circle on the carpet and about the records that had been removed from the archive. She thought about the difference between not knowing and not looking, and which one she was currently engaged in, and whether those two versions led to meaningfully different places from here. She did not press play. She was not ready, or she was afraid, or those were the same thing. And then she got up and went upstairs, and stood in the hallway outside her bedroom door. The cold at the top of the stairs was where it always was, its familiar location, its familiar temperature. She stood in it for a moment, and it occurred to her that she had stopped flinching when she walked through it. From a thing she noticed with alarm, to a thing she noticed the way you notice a feature of a house you have decided is home. She opened the bedroom door and left it open, the first time since the second night, when she had been afraid, and had not known yet that afraid was not quite the right word for what this was, and got into bed and lay in the dark, and listened to the house settle around her. The cold, she thought, felt closer than the landing tonight. Not inside the room, at the threshold. As though something had come as far as it had ever managed to come, and was waiting to understand what the open door meant. She watched the footage on a Sunday morning, 3 days after she had recorded it. She had carried the phone around for those 3 days in the way you carry something you have agreed to deal with and have not yet dealt with, aware of it, periodically reminded of it, performing the ordinary business of the week around it. She had gone to work. She had stood in the second bedroom on a Saturday afternoon and looked at the yellow star and the bare brackets and the circle on the carpet and had gone back downstairs without touching anything and had cooked dinner and watched something on television that she could not, by Sunday morning, have summarized. On Sunday morning, she made coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and placed the phone in front of her and pressed play without allowing herself a pause, because she had learned from the previous attempts that the pause was where the not doing lived. The footage was dark. She had left the landing light on the assumption that a thin line of it would come under the bedroom door and give the camera enough to work with. And it had. Barely. The room was visible in grays and shadows. For the first 38 minutes, nothing moved. She watched it at double speed, the time counter in the corner ticking upward, and the room stayed still, and the line under the door stayed unchanged. And she began to construct, not entirely without relief, the hypothesis that the motion sensor had triggered on a moth or a shift in the curtain from a draft, that the 43 minutes was nothing, that the phone would give her nothing and she could put it away. At 38 minutes and 40 seconds, something changed in the quality of the light under the door. She stopped the footage and took it back and watched it at normal speed. The line of gold under the door, thin, steady, the landing light as it had been when she went to bed, shifted. But a gradual dimming across the full length of the gap, as though something had settled against the other side of the door and was blocking the light with its body. Slowly, from the left side of the gap to the right, until the line was almost entirely dark, then stillness. Then, for the next 4.5 minutes, nothing. Just the dark room and the dark line, and the faint sound of the house that the phone's microphone had picked up, which was, on the recording, oddly amplified. The creak, the cylinder, the particular texture of a house's silence that is not silence at all but a lower frequency of presence. She paused the footage. She sat with her coffee for a long time, looking at the paused image. The still frame showed the dark room and the almost dark line under the door, uniformly dark except at the left-hand edge, where the gap between door and frame was marginally wider than at the rest of its length. In that narrow remainder of light, there was a shape, small, low, the profile of what might have been a hand pressed flat against the base of the door from the outside, fingers just distinguishable from palm, the whole thing no bigger than what a 7-year-old's hand would be. She could not be certain. The resolution was the resolution of a phone camera in near dark, not designed for certainty, but she could not make it into anything else either. She had tried. She sat there and tried, turning it into a fold of carpet, a draft excluder, the trick of low-resolution compression on a dark image, and none of it held. She stared at it until her eyes lost focus, and the image blurred and came back and blurred again. Flat against the surface and sat still and breathed deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe in the months after the marriage ended, when she had needed techniques for staying inside a difficult present rather than fleeing it. Then she picked the phone up and watched the rest. At 4 minutes and 22 seconds, the door opened. Not suddenly, no fling, no drama, but slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who does not want to make noise. It opened to about 30 degrees and stopped there, and in the gap there was only the hallway dark. The landing light reduced now to a thin peripheral glow around the edges of the frame. Mara watched herself on the screen, asleep in the bed, her back to the camera, the covers moving slightly with her breathing. She watched the door standing open. She watched the dark in the gap. Then she saw the shape. It was at the foot of the bed. Small, still, and so close in tone to the surrounding dark that she might have missed it at any other speed. She did miss it at double speed, which was why she had not seen it before. But at normal speed it was there, and once she had seen it, she could not unsee it. The rough outline of a child, sitting or crouching at the foot of the bed, facing toward her sleeping form, entirely motionless. For the remainder of the recording, 1 minute and 16 seconds, it did not move. It was simply there, in the dark, at the foot of the bed, and Mara was asleep 3 feet away, and then the battery warning cut the footage off. She sat with the phone on the kitchen table for a long time after the footage ended. She was not screaming, she was not crying, and she registered this with one part of her mind, while another part sat very quietly with what she had just seen, examining it carefully the way you examine a thing that is going to require a decision from you. and you want to be sure you have looked at all of it before you decide. What she felt was not, she was surprised to find, the cold, unambiguous terror of the first nights. It was something more complicated, a layered thing, grief somewhere underneath it, as though the closed door each morning and the cold at the top of the stairs and the handprint and the name in the cupboard had been arranging themselves all along toward exactly this footage, and finding it was less a shock than a confirmation. She found Callum Marsh the following week. It took 3 days of careful searching and a willingness to go further into the public record than she had gone before: electoral rolls, public social media, an archived local newspaper mention from 2004 that gave her a town and a context. He lived in Cumbria now, in a village outside Kendal, far enough from London that the distance felt deliberate. He was on Facebook under his own name, the profile sparse and infrequently updated. The profile photograph showing a man in his 50s on a hillside in weather that looked like it required effort. She sent a message. She wrote it and rewrote it 4 times, because what she was writing was a message to a person she had never met, asking him whether his dead daughter was living in her bedroom. And there is no established etiquette for this, no form of words that makes it ordinary. In the end, she kept it as simple as she could. She said she was the current tenant of the house on Selby Road, that she had found the name in the airing cupboard, that she had done the research, that she had seen the footage, and that she would very much like to speak with him if he was willing. She said she was not frightened, which was not entirely true, but felt like the most useful thing to say. She sent it at 11 at night and went to bed. He replied the next morning, 2 sentences. He said he had been wondering when someone would write. He said he would meet her, but not on the phone. She drove to Cumbria on a Saturday, 3 weeks into December, when the light had gone short and the motorway ran through a landscape the color of pewter. She had offered to meet anywhere convenient to him. He had suggested a pub in the village, neutral ground, public, the instinct of a person who has been careful for a long time about the terms on which he engages with what the house had done to his life. He was already there when she arrived, 20 minutes early as she was, in a corner seat with a half-finished pint and the settled, particular stillness of someone who has been waiting, not impatiently, not anxiously, but in the way of a person for whom waiting has become a practice state, a thing they are good at and have had cause to become good at. He was not what she had expected, though she would have been hard-pressed, if asked, to say what she had expected. He was a large man made smaller by some internal reduction, broad-shouldered but held in a way that took up less room than his frame suggested, with the kind of face that has been weathered by outdoor life and by something else, something that came from the inside and that had settled into a composure that was clearly hard-won and clearly genuine. He looked at her for a moment when she sat down in the way of a man taking a measurement, and then he said that she looked all right. And she said she was, and he said good. And there was a pause in which they both understood the weight of the conversation they were about to have. He told her about Iris. He had not, he said, talked about her to anyone outside the immediate family for almost 20 years. Not because the grief had made it impossible, but because the specific nature of what had happened made it a thing he had learned to keep enclosed. Iris had been 7 when she died. She had fallen on the stairs, the top of the stairs, near the landing, in the early hours of a November morning. He had heard it. He had come out of his bedroom to find her at the bottom of the staircase, and she had still been alive when the ambulance came. And she had died in hospital the following morning without recovering consciousness. It was the kind of accident that has no adequate explanation and no attributable cause, and leaves behind it a silence that no subsequent noise can fill. He had stayed in the house for 8 months after. His wife had left within the first 3, unable to remain in the rooms where the fact of it was in every surface and every angle of light. He had stayed because leaving felt like a second abandonment, and because he had started, in those 8 months, to notice things. Not at first. At first there was only the grief, which occupied every available space. But gradually, in the quieter periods, he had begun to be aware of the house in a way he had not been while Iris was alive. The door, the cold, the sounds at night that were not the sounds a house makes when it is empty. He had not been afraid, he said. This was the thing he needed her to understand. He had never been afraid of it. He had then, instead, broken open by it, by the awareness that something remained, that the house held something of his daughter that had not gone wherever the rest of her had gone, and that this something was not the Iris he had known, but was also not nothing. A remainder, a residue. He used that word precisely, the word of a man who has spent a long time finding the right language for an experience that does not have established language. A residue of a child who had loved the house and had died in it suddenly and had not, for whatever reason, entirely left. He had moved away to survive it. Not because he was frightened, but because staying, with the remainder of his daughter 3 feet away on the other side of every door, had been destroying him in a way he could not sustain indefinitely. He had sold the house. He had moved north. He had built a life that worked, more or less, at the distance he maintained. He was not, he said carefully, unhappy. He had learned to think of the house on Selby Road as a place where a part of Iris still existed, which was different from a comfort, but was not entirely without it. Then he looked at her across the table and said that she should understand one thing. Iris, in life, had been a gentle child, quiet, watchful. She had not been given to cruelty or malice. Whatever she had become in the house, he did not believe those qualities had changed. But he said, and here his voice took on a different register, careful, precise, the voice of a man who has earned the right to say something and is choosing his words for it. Loneliness. The specific loneliness of something that is neither fully present nor fully gone, existing in the margin between one state and another, waiting for acknowledgement that does not come. That loneliness, given long enough, becomes something that is harder to define, something that wants. He had not stayed long enough to understand what it wanted. He did not know what it would do with wanting if it was given long enough to develop it fully. He thought she should know that. She drove home in the dark, 4 hours south along the motorway, with the lights regular above her and the radio on and then off again, because neither music nor voices were what the journey required. She thought about what Callum Marsh had said, and about what he had not said. The things that lived in the pauses of a man who has spent 20 years finding the containable words for an experience and has learned very precisely where the containable words end. She thought about the footage and the small still shape at the foot of her bed, sitting in the dark with what she could only call patience. And she thought about a child who scratches her name into a hidden wall and places a yellow star on a window frame at the precise height of her own reach, and presses her hand to the bathroom glass again and again with the slow, deliberate care of a gesture meant to be found. Not a haunting in any of the senses she had brought to the word before she moved to Selby Road. Something more like insistence. Something more like, I was here, and I am still here, and I would like someone to know it. She was home by 10. She parked on the street and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house through the windscreen. The lights were off, as she had left them. The windows were dark, reflecting the orange of the street lamp in the way that dark windows do, opaque and uninformative. It was a perfectly ordinary house in a perfectly ordinary terrace, indistinguishable from its neighbors, presenting exactly the same face to the street that it had presented the day she arrived, and the day before that, and every day before that going back to 1934, giving nothing away to anyone who did not know what to look for. She unlocked the door and went inside and turned on the hallway light. The cold at the top of the stairs was in its usual place. She stood at the bottom and looked up at it for a long moment, and then she said, aloud into the quiet house, that she was home. The cold stayed where it was. The house was still, but something in the quality of the stillness, and she was aware that she was making a distinction that she could not have explained to anyone who had not spent 3 months in this house. Learning the specific register of its silence was different from the stillness of an empty room. It was the stillness of something that had heard. She went upstairs. She went past the cold spot and into the bedroom and got into bed and left the door open, as she always did now. And she lay in the dark and listened to the house, and after a while she heard, from the direction of the second bedroom, 4 or 5 notes of a small music box, brief and clear, and then nothing. She closed her eyes. She kept them closed. December passed, and January and February came in gray and relentless off the North Sea, driving sleet against the front windows of the house on Selby Road and turning the garden into a shallow lake that drained slowly over the course of each morning into the heavy clay beneath. Mara had started tending the garden in the autumn, clearing the overgrown buddleia and cutting back the long grass and planting bulbs along the back fence in the reasonable expectation of spring. And she checked the progress of these bulbs each morning through the kitchen window as a form of evidence. Evidence of time passing, of the ordinary world making its ordinary promises and keeping them. The bulbs were coming. She had faith in the bulbs. She had told no one about the footage. She had told no one about Callum Marsh, or the drive to Cumbria, or the pub conversation, or the warning about loneliness. She had told her sister, when pressed, that the house was going well, that she was sleeping better than she had in years, that the commute was manageable, that she was thinking of getting a cat. The cat was a recent thought, not yet a plan, and she was aware that there was something she was not examining too closely about the timing of it, about the specific desire for warm and living company that had arrived in her. Quietly, during the months since December, she had not gotten a cat yet. She was not sure she needed to. She had established, over the months since the Cumbria visit, a relationship with the house that she could not have described to anyone with any confidence that they would recognize it as what she meant by it, would not have described it even to Callum Marsh, who would have understood the terms better than anyone, because describing it felt like a thing that would change it, in the way that certain states of equilibrium only persist in the absence of direct examination. And yet relationship was the word that kept arriving when she reached for one, and she had stopped arguing with it. She had stopped being afraid. She was not sure exactly when this had happened, whether there had been a moment or whether it had simply accumulated, a gradient of adjustment so gradual it had no identifiable start. She had left the bedroom door open every night since December and slept well every night since. The cold at the top of the stairs remained in its position, and she walked through it each morning and each evening and had ceased to register it as cold in any alarming sense, and had begun instead to register it as a kind of marker, the way you register a familiar landmark on a route you walk every day, without conscious attention, but with a faint subliminal acknowledgement of placement, of location, of here. She spoke aloud in the house sometimes. Not constantly, not in the animated way of a person who has convinced themselves they are not alone, but occasionally and specifically, saying good night when she went upstairs, saying she'd have a difficult day when she had. Once standing at the kitchen counter eating toast at midnight after a week in which several things had gone wrong in sequence, and telling the quiet house, in a conversational and unsentimental tone, exactly what they were. She felt, when she did this, the specific quality of being heard that she had first noticed the night she came home from Cumbria and stood in the hallway. It was not a quality she could have quantified. It was not warmth or light or any shift in the temperature of the air. It was simply that the silence that answered her was a different quality of silence from the silence of an empty room, and she had lived in both long enough by now to know the difference. The music box played occasionally. Not every night, not on any schedule she could identify. Irregularly, briefly, always the same few notes in the same sequence. Always from the direction of the second bedroom. Always winding down at the end as clockwork does, trailing off into quiet. She had not gone back into the second bedroom since the Wednesday morning in November, when she had stood in the doorway looking at the yellow star. She was not sure this was a rule she had made or simply a habit that had formed without her making it. And she had made a general policy over the winter and into the spring of leaving certain distinctions unexamined, finding that the examined ones resolved less cleanly than the ones she simply gave time. The handprint appeared on the bathroom window most mornings still. She had stopped wiping it off in October. By February, she found she noticed its absence on the occasional mornings when it wasn't there, more than she noticed its presence on the mornings when it was. In March, her sister came to stay for a weekend. Nadia was 3 years younger than Mara and lived with her family in Bristol and had been, during the months of the divorce and its aftermath, the person Mara had called most often and leaned on most thoroughly. She was a practical, warm woman who expressed concern through action, who arrived with food she had made the day before and a bottle of good wine and the unspoken agenda of assessing, with love, whether her sister was actually all right or was performing all right in a way that required gentle but persistent excavation. She was good at excavation. Mara had been braced for it. What Nadia did instead was look at the house carefully and say that Mara seemed different. Not better or worse, just different in a way that was difficult to specify. More settled, perhaps. More rooted. Like a person who has found the place they were supposed to be in, which she said was not something she had expected to be saying about a mid-terrace rental in a suburb. But there it was. She made this observation on the Friday evening over dinner, and Mara said that she had found she liked it here. And this was true, and was also the least of what was true, and Nadia looked at her for a moment with the look she had that meant she was deciding whether to press and decided, on this occasion, not to. They had dinner and drank the wine and talked, the easy and circular talk of sisters who have known each other for 35 years and have long since covered the ground that requires effort, and can now simply move across the familiar territory of each other's company without destination. It was good. It reminded Mara of the life she had outside the house, the life that ran alongside the house's particular interior life, the colleagues and the phone calls and the sister in Bristol, and the season turning in the garden. And she found this reminder useful and warming rather than jarring, which seemed like a sign of something healthy, though she was careful about deciding too quickly what it was a sign of. On the Saturday morning, Nadia came downstairs before Mara and made coffee, and was sitting at the kitchen table when Mara came down. And she had a look on her face that was not quite the look of someone who has just woken up, and not quite the look of something else. And Mara asked if she was all right, and Nadia said yes, and then said that she had gotten up in the night for a glass of water, and had walked through the upstairs hallway in the dark, and had, she paused here, and chose a word carefully, felt something. She did not say what she felt like. She said the word something in the tone of a person who has several more specific words available, and has chosen the vaguest one as a form of self-protection. And Mara said, I know. And Nadia looked at her, and Mara said it was all right. And for a moment they sat across the table from each other with the coffee between them, and Nadia looked at her sister in the careful, measuring way she had, and Mara held the look steadily. And then Nadia nodded once and picked up her coffee, and that was for the rest of the weekend. That she noticed the cups on Sunday morning. Mara had come downstairs first and put the kettle on and had, without thinking, and this was the part that she turned over afterward, though without thinking, the automaticity of it, taken 2 mugs from the cupboard and set them beside the kettle. She was standing at the window looking at the garden where the first of the bulb shoots were showing, small and green and keeping their promise, when Nadia came in and stopped and looked at the 2 cups and said nothing for a moment, and then said gently that she had only wanted tea if Mara was making it anyway. And Mara looked at the 2 cups and looked at Nadia and said, of course, I was making it anyway, and turned back to the window and looked at the garden and felt the thing she was not ready to look at directly moving at the edge of her peripheral vision, as it had been moving for some time. Nadia left on the Sunday afternoon, kissing Mara's cheek and holding her by both arms for a moment in the hallway, and looking at her with the specific expression of a person who has love enough to let something go without resolution and trust enough to believe resolution will come, or at least that the absence of it is not the same as disaster. She said calmly. Mara said, I will. Both of these were true. The house was quiet after she left in the way that houses are quiet after people leave. The quality of the absence shaped by the specific person who had been present. The warmth of them still in the rooms for a while before it dissipated. Mara stood in the hallway and listened to it. Then she went upstairs and stood at the door of the second bedroom for the first time in months, and put her hand flat on the door and held it there without opening it. The wood was warm. This was explainable. The afternoon sun came through the window and the room had been closed and heat accumulated, and it was also, regardless of explanation, warm in a way that settled something in her chest she had not known was unsettled. She did not open the door. She took her hand away and stood for a moment, and then she went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 cups still sitting beside the kettle where she had put them, and she sat with herself about the without thinking, about the automatic reaching for 2, and tried to hold it up to an honest light. The spring came on slowly, and then all at once in the way it does, and the bulbs along the back fence opened in a sequence she had chosen in the autumn, crocuses first, then daffodils, then the tulips she had put in deepest of all, and which arrived last and stayed longest. She began working in the garden on weekend afternoons, clearing the remaining dead growth from the winter and turning the soil in the raised beds that had been there when she arrived and had grown nothing in the time before her. She had plans for the beds. She had already bought seed packets. The plans were for food she would grow and cook in the autumn, which meant she was thinking of herself as a person who would be here in the autumn, which she noted without alarm. She called Callum Marsh in April. She had not spoken to him since the pub in December and had thought of him often, in the way you think of someone who has given you information that continues to unfold over time, each layer of understanding arriving slightly later than the last. She said she wanted to tell him that it was all right. She said she thought he should know that. There was a long pause on the line, and then he said he was glad. And there was something in the way he said it that she could not fully interpret, relief, possibly, and underneath it something more complex. A layered thing which she thought might have been grief, taking one of its subtler, stranger forms. She said she thought Iris was all right too, to the extent that she could say that, and she meant it. Another pause. He said thank you, and she said she would send him photographs of the garden when the tulips were properly out, which she recognized even as she said it as an odd thing to offer a person she had met once, but which felt, in the specific context of their specific conversation, entirely right. She sent the photographs. He sent back a single word. Beautiful. The summer arrived and extended itself generously into September, and the house on Selby Road sat in it with the ease of a house that has been lived in well, the garden overgrown again in the productive, intentional way of a space that is being used rather than managed, The windows open in the evenings to let in the last of the warmth. Mara cooked from the garden, grew competent with the things that had done well, made notes about the things that hadn't, planned for next year, with the quiet confidence of someone who was certain of being somewhere. She had not gotten a cat. Her sister did not bring up the cups again. On a Wednesday evening in late September, Mara came home from work to find the second bedroom door standing open. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked at it. She had not opened it. She had not been in that room since the Wednesday morning in November, when she had stood at the threshold, looking at the yellow star and the circle on the carpet and the bare brackets, and had pulled the door closed and gone to work. It had been closed for nearly a year, and now it stood open by perhaps 6 inches, showing a slice of the room inside, the carpet, the light from the window, the edge of the bare wall, and in the slice of light from the window, visible only because of the specific angle and the specific hour and the way the late September sun came low and golden through the west-facing glass, a small yellow star on the inside of the window frame, shining. She stood at the top of the stairs for a long time. The cold at the top of the stairs was in its place around her, familiar and indexical, the reliable marker. She looked at the open door and the stripe of light and the star, and she thought about everything she knew about this house, and everything she didn't know, and she thought about Callum Marsh's warning, and about the 2 cups set out without thinking, and about the handprint on the bathroom glass that she checked for each morning and missed when it wasn't there. She thought about a 7-year-old child who wanted, above all things, to be known. She put her hand on the door and held it there for a moment, feeling the warmth of it, the same warmth as before. Then she pushed it slowly open and stepped inside for the first time in almost a year, into the late afternoon light, and stood in the middle of the room. The music box was on the floor near the far wall, in the circle of compressed carpet where a bed had once been. It was small, white-painted wood, a child's thing, its lid standing open. She had not put it there. She had not known it was there. She crouched and looked at it, and then reached out and touched the small metal comb inside with the tip of one finger, lightly, not enough to wind it, just enough to know it was real. She stayed in the room for a while. There was nothing dramatic to report about this. No temperature drop, no sound, no visible shape. The room was simply a room in the late afternoon light, with the ordinary sounds of the street coming through the window and the golden sun moving slowly across the floor. She sat down on the carpet, her back against the wall beneath the window, in the place where the bed had been, and looked at the room from that angle and thought about a child who had looked at it from this angle too, from this exact place, in this same light. And she stayed there until the sun had moved off the floor and the light had changed to the softer, cooler light of early evening. Then she got up and she left the door open behind her, and she went downstairs and began making dinner. And the house was quiet around her in the way it was quiet, in the way she had come to know. And after a while she realized she had taken 2 plates from the cupboard and set them both on a table. And she stood and looked at them for a moment, and then she left them both where they were. She sat down and ate, in the quiet house, in the easy-coming autumn dark.